Congratulations, today is your day. You're off to observability. It's off and away. You have brains in your head, you have hands on keyboard. You can steer yourself any direction you go toward. So once upon a time, I worked at a company that had a lot of technical debt. We wanted to do every single thing in the book, and it turns out that we had 20 ways to do just about anything. And we always had the paralysis of figuring out, what are we going to do, how are we going to do it? And I don't think any of the people who designed these 20 systems were trying to do a bad job or mess up their coworkers. Everything starts from good intentions, right? We think about things like Rackspace's model of fanatical support, of doing whatever it takes to support the customer. Or maybe we think of Google, focus on the user and everything else will follow. But in either case, the road to happiness, you embark upon what you think is the road to happiness, and you wind up creating a bunch of pain for your future coworkers, or maybe for your future self. And why is this? I think we get there by having the wrong incentives, by incentivizing people to do the wrong things, by promoting people for doing the wrong things, and not promoting people for doing the right things. A lot of this happens because organizations think, this would never work at my scale. I can't possibly use this unless it was invented here. How many of you work at organizations like that? Or used to work at organizations like that? Yeah, you know what I mean. Great. Or how many of you have seen the situation of chrome polishing, where someone is working on a project that's not the most important thing that the business needs, but instead is their pet project that they want to make as perfect as possible? How many of you have seen that? Okay, how many of you are guilty of doing this yourself? Good, I'm glad we're a self-reflective crowd, right? Like, whether you call it chrome polishing, make-work projects, or resume-driven development, right? Like, if you have too much autonomy over your own schedule, you can wind up choosing to make decisions that are not optimal for your organization. We have to think about what's the highest impact thing that I as an engineer can be doing right now. Or maybe you're in an organization that has the opposite of this problem. How many of you have no choice over your tooling whatsoever? It's, whatever your boss bought 5 years ago, right? Like, some of us do work at organizations like that. If you don't have control over your tools, then how can you possibly build the right thing for your users? So I think there's a better way of approaching things, and that's what my talk is about today. So in order to ground ourselves, we have to think about, what are we here trying to accomplish? What are we trying to do as engineers? And especially, what are we trying to do as observability monitoring or infrastructure engineers of some flavor? And I think at the end of the day, what we want is we want our company to be successful because our company's customers are happy, which requires that our service be appropriately reliable and scalable. You saw the talk on SLOs from earlier today, right? Hashtag include standard SLO.h. So I also want to focus on what scalability means. We've talked about what reliability means, but I think scalability has two critical dimensions. Scalability means that your humans don't burn out, and that your machines can keep serving your users. I've unfortunately seen a lot of organizations that churn through their humans and feed blood, sweat, and tears to the machines. That's not a scalable organization. That's not a scalable service. And I think that in order to make sure that we can run our systems scalably and sustainably, that's why we need observability. Observability in and of itself is not a goal. Observability is how we achieve high-performance systems, high-performing organizations. And I think that observability is a socio-technical property, right? It pertains to the humans and the computer system together. You can't separate it out, right? That observability relies upon you taking this data and using it to make a decision, right? That if you're just emitting charts and graphs and monitoring and logs and metrics and traces, and you're not doing something with it, that's not observability. I also want to focus people on the idea of incentives, right? That importance of your service does not mean that there's a line of 10 people standing at your door demanding to have you gatekeep their pull request, right? You have to get out of the business of feeling like you are important because there's a line of people waiting to talk to you. Instead, what we have to think about is how do we engineer our services so that everyone's work is easier? It does not make sense to make your job easier and make some other team's job harder, right? We can't shovel work over the fence. That's the land before DevOps, and we know that's not a good land. The final thing that I want to kind of disabuse you of is the idea that engineering means writing software. Instead, we have to think about engineering as the art of solving problems. So let's talk about the problem, right? The problem is people have the wrong incentives, they build the wrong software, and then people burn out and users are unhappy. So let's fix this. We have to change the incentives. We have to change how we reward people. So maybe instead of coming up here on the stage high and saying, look at this thing I duct taped, isn't it awesome? Like, look at how I barely managed to make it work, right? Let's not do that. Instead, let's talk about our success cases, right? And let's not just pat ourselves on the back and say, yay, but like, we need to talk about why is this relevant to this audience? What was the problem we were trying to solve? What did you try? What didn't work? Kind of, don't just show us your positive results, show us the things that didn't work along the way as well. Because otherwise, people are going to stumble into those holes as well. And how did you ultimately solve the problem? And how can other people make use of your work? How can they reuse it? And did we actually save work? Did we actually make our system better? This does not mean that you need to tell people, this is how much code I wrote, right? Please don't tell us, hey, we're open sourcing 1 million lines of code. Great, that's wonderful. But that doesn't actually solve people's problems. We cannot continue glorifying creating complexity. Go back to your organizations and think about, what does your promotion process look like? Does it reward people for how many design docs they wrote or how many lines of code, or does it reward them for solving problems? Open source exists, right? It's out there. You can use it. Your coworker's code exists. Chances are someone has already tried to solve this problem. You just need to look around for it and find it and extend what they've built. And yes, vendors do exist. Full disclosure, I do work for a vendor, right? And without being too pitchy, is this a strategic advantage for your company to build this, or does it make better sense to spend your valuable time doing something else? As long as that solution that you buy meets your needs. So, that's a whole bunch of words. Some of you in the audience are probably thinking, Liz, tell me what to do. Seriously, tell me what to do. Right? I like to come here and listen to speakers pontificate on stage and tell me what to do. Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. The reason that I'm not going to tell you what to do, whether you should build, buy, use open source, is that your situation is completely unique. So instead, I'm going to ask you some rhetorical questions. What problem are you trying to solve when you say, I want to improve my monitoring, or I want to improve my observability? And often, the problem that you are solving is not about you. What problem are your customers having? That's really the more important question, right? And sometimes in that case, your customer is your end users, or sometimes maybe your customer is yourself, or maybe if you're a platform team, your customers are your software engineers that you're trying to improve the productivity of. But still, you have to focus on them, not necessarily yourself. And you have to ask the questions of why repeatedly. And I say why and not how here. I know John Allspaw is about to have a heart attack, right? The reason I'm saying why here is because this is trying to uncover not what happened during an incident, but instead trying to uncover what's the deeper seated need, right? How do I not just tactically solve a problem, but strategically solve a wider range of use cases so that I don't wind up building a single purpose tool that only works for me. If you ask how too early, right, like, your how is I need more graphs, you may miss that maybe graphs are not the solution. Maybe you need traces instead, or maybe you need something else entirely, right? Like, don't over-constrain your problem too early. And you also have to think about questions like, who's going to run this, right? Running software has an ongoing cost. So you have to think about who's going to run this, what's the cost on them, who's going to maintain it. And when I say maintain, I talk about maintenance in the product management sense, right? You cannot develop code and just put it on a shelf, right? You have to always be adapting it to the needs of people who are currently using it and for people who might be using it in the future. Is this a collection of random features, or is this actually well-maintained code? I want to tell you about a case study from my previous employer in which there is a product that we'll call Rock Pusher. And Rock Pusher was not actually thought of as a product inside the company. It was just a collection of code that anyone could extend, that anyone was expected to run their own instance of if they wanted to rock push some releases, right? Not very nice. And it wound up being this giant agglomeration of do this version 2, do this version 3, do that, right? Like, it was not a sustainable software system. So think about who's going to run it, who's going to maintain it. And I think that at the end of the day, we also have to document what options did I consider, right? We have to look left and right, and then we have to tell each other about what we found. Shout out here to Etsy, who said, this is our evaluation process for a cloud vendor. This is what we found. They probably saved every single other company shopping for a cloud vendor hundreds of hours of work by doing that. And we also have to think about maybe you're not looking for one solution. Maybe you need more than one thing, or maybe you need to adapt an existing tool instead of just counting on one magical tool to solve your problem. So adapt things, right? You can build on top of multiple different platforms and adapt things that are in place to solve your current problem. And you have to think about the idea that anytime you write new code and you do not upstream it, you are creating tech debt. Shout out to an unnamed finance company who forked Kubernetes and are running their own Kubernetes that's forked and not upstreamed. So running software again, right? Like operational tech debt is absolutely a thing, and you are going to be paying both the principal and the interest on it for a very long time. And if you're at a startup like me, right? Maybe not so if you're Google with a giant advertising machine, but if you're at a startup like me, if you build the wrong thing, if you don't laser focus on how can I add the most value, if you build the wrong thing, that's going to ruin your company. Your company will go out of business because it did not build the right things and it did not spend the energy where it needed to. So that was kind of depressing. Let's talk about how to positively do these things. So how do we figure out how to build the right software? I think the way that we do that is first, we have to collaborate within our organizations. We have to do user studies to figure out where's the problem, what am I trying to solve, and know really, right, like what are the engineers who are frustrated about being paged telling me? Or what are the people who are having these outages and postmortems that indicate that they're having a long time to resolve? What's that telling me? And then you have to look around and look at who's encountered this before. Maybe you'll see something similar and be able to adapt it. But also be careful of feature creep, right? Like maybe you don't want to have 20 things, but also maybe jam packing everything into one thing is not great either. So make sure your code is extensible. Future colleagues will thank you. And if you document things and provide examples, documenting things is amazing. And this doesn't have to be documenting your own software. It turns out that you documenting open source software running within your company is very useful. The next time someone comes along and asks, how do I use foobar at Fastco? You'll be able to answer that question because maybe there will be a stack you can spin up. Maybe there will be something you can clone in order to spin up your own instance of it. Documentation saves a whole bunch of time. And make sure you maintain that documentation because if you document something that exhibits anti-patterns, guess what? It'll be cloned 100 times before you notice. Keep that up to date. And also focus on upskilling each other, right? Like if you help your colleagues better use the tools that you already have, that winds up being a hell of a lot easier than having people have to learn a new tool every single time and getting really, really grumpy about it. People need to be empowered to improve the tools that they work on as well as learning better how to use those tools, right? If you don't have autonomy over your tools, then you're not going to be able to adapt them to the circumstances that you're facing. If you don't do these things, if you create user confusion, that's costly. That's costly in terms of wasted engineering time, and it's costly in terms of longer incidents, right? Don't just think about, I want to stop being nagged about this thing, so I'm going to create a process that requires people to spend 40 minutes filling out this form before they can talk to me, right? Like, you've just pushed the work elsewhere, right? Make things simple, make things easier across the board for everyone. And share your tools and code, right? Like, make sure that it's discoverable. If your organization has an internal GitHub that has 2,000 different repositories, you're never going to be able to find that repository that has the code that you could fork, right? You have to understand and document these things so that other people can find that code, so that you can find that code and use the same code as other people in your organization. But I think once you've done that, you also need to think about, what can I bring to an audience like this? What can I bring to Monitorama? And I think one thing that we can all do a better job of is think about, what's the common language that we use, right? And this is, I think, a thing that open census and open tracing are finally solving with open telemetry, right? Where we don't need, 5 different descriptions of, is this an annotation, is this baggage, right? Like, I think that once we have common definitions and common API specs, it does make things a lot easier. And do not dump your hacks on the community. The community is a no dumping zone. Right? Like, make sure that if you talk to the public about something, that it's going to be something that someone else is going to want to use, that it's well maintained, that it's clean, that's something that someone really is going to be excited about working on. And you have to explain to other people, what were you thinking when you wrote this? Like, in the positive sense, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to show people, like, a white room containing your object, right? Like, how was this created? Why was it created? If you don't explain this context, then people are going to waste a lot of time evaluating your solution only to find out, it has completely different needs or assumptions. Or people may not even consider it because, they can't understand what's this for. And upstream your code, upstream your specs, right? Don't be that unnamed finance company who's running their own fork of Kubernetes, right? Like, if you don't have to run the code anymore, it's so much better. And if you are a company that is releasing an open source project for the first time, right? Like, find another company that's willing to partner with you on this, right? Have external maintainers, because kind of single company projects are really doomed to be abandoned one day. And document your technical decisions, right? Like, this is a useful process both for community calls for review of the API, things like Python enhancement proposals, right? Not performance expectation plans. PEP has multiple different meanings, sadly. And that way people inside of and outside your organizations can learn from the history of what's gone on in the code. Why are things the way that they are? I think at the end of the day, success at our jobs of fostering monitoring and of fostering observability does not demand heroism. We don't have to be heroes approving pull requests at 4 a.m. We don't have to be heroes who are standing there, looking at dashboards all the time. We can spread out that load by sharing our tooling and developing better tooling. I have to say, in response to Kenny's talk, right? Like, we don't need artisanal automation, right? Artisanal automation is the enemy. Let's standardize our automation and focus our artisanry on the parts that are really, really important. And by the way, I resemble his mark about Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn. So that's it from me. Think about what you're writing, write less software. And the way that you do that is look around, evaluate the solutions, collaborate with other people, and then share what you learn. Thank you. I guess I'll take questions. Are there questions? No, I'm not going to be Oprah. I'm not going to hand out cars. I'm sorry. All right, well, yeah. Okay, the question was, what was the impetus for this talk? The reason I wanted to encourage people to think and look around them is that, unfortunately, I've seen a lot of companies, unfortunately, Google included, right, like build their own thing and not necessarily work with the community on building it the right way and building it in a coherent way. The example that I would give you is actually from outside of the observability space and is Bigtable. So I worked on Bigtable for a long time. And the interesting thing was Google published a white paper on Bigtable that said, here's an example of a system that exists at Google, and no, you can't have it, and no, you can't have any of the source. These are just some of the concepts. And then HBase came along and said, hey, that looks really cool. We're going to create our own variant of Bigtable. And then the implementation spec kind of went its own way. And then when Google Cloud came along and said, hey, wait a second, we have this Bigtable thing. Let's make Cloud Bigtable. Now they had to write an API adapter, right? They had to adapt the concepts from HBase back into Bigtable, right? And it was just gigantically messy and confusing. And Cloud Bigtable participates in the HBase community now, but it's kind of a lot messier than if they'd kind of kept a lot of this API spec and why did we do it? How did we do it? Let's have this open dialogue continuing rather than just, throwing out the Bigtable paper and saying, hey, here you go. This is technology we developed 2 years ago. We're done with it. You go have it, right? That's why I say, please don't treat the community as a dumping ground. Does that make some sense? So I think that we're seeing this happen with observability and monitoring tools today, where people are developing their own things that diverge slightly from common specifications, use slightly different language, and I think that that's something that we really need to think about in terms of how do we encourage people to use the same tools? How do we encourage people to use the same terminology, at least when we're not confused when talking to each other? Awesome. Any other questions?
What are some of the signs you've seen that lead you to think, hey, this tool or this code probably should go out to the community? This is something I think what sort of hints do you get that this is something that might have more uptake?
I think the signs are easier to spot in a larger company, because in a larger company, if people are clamoring to all use your common platform, maybe there's more to it, maybe there's other people who could benefit from it. I think at a smaller company, those signs tend to be, if people are commonly asking that same question and saying, hey, I'm looking around for a solution to X, but I haven't found one yet. Let me throw one out there, for instance. Someone here in this audience will probably get very rich off of this. So when I was at Google, there is a tool where you could throw logs at this binary, and it wouldn't index them. It would do nothing but write them to the equivalent of S3 and let you look for logs from a specific machine at a specific timestamp. Every single logging product I've seen tries to index and do fancy stuff, but if you're just trying to treat logs as a place of last resort and have indexes into those logs, right? To my knowledge, no one has built that precise thing of being able to look at a arbitrary, big giant collection of terabytes of logs and just pick out one line, right, and look up and down from that line. Because everyone is so focused on the problem of searching and indexing, right? So if you're at a startup and you're like, oh my God, right, I built this thing because this was a need that we had, right? And you keep on encountering people who are asking you, I had this problem and I couldn't find anything else, right? Then maybe that's the thing you want to open source, right? And you can go to those people who said, hey, this problem that I have, and get them to collaborate with you so that you have a community of 2 or 3 or 4 companies working on it from the beginning rather than putting your one thing out there and then either it withers away or it doesn't. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do I have an example of someone or something that's done this well? I think that the fact that people converged on creating open tracing and creating open census was a positive step towards actually let's put out common kind of interfaces and code that people can compile against, right? And then I think the fact that those two things have converged, right? Like I think that that's an even better sign that people are willing to put their egos aside and say, you know what, it's better for the community if we have one standard, not two, right? So that I think is probably in our space one of the most promising things I've seen in a little while. Okay, last question. Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you.